You can cry on command.
Options, but they are usually very fast, and that is why I decided to create this. Welcome to Free Talk, the show to help you learn English the fun and simple way. Ready?
Hello, you, and welcome back to Free Talk Podcast, the show where we have one objective: to take your English to the next level, the fun and simple way. Welcome to the first episode of this month, and as I told you, this month we are going to have 3 times the usual podcast. So we are going to have episodes on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And today we will kick it off. That means today we will start this marathon of podcast for you. Well, just the other day I was talking with my brother and we were brainstorming. So do you know what is brainstorming? Brainstorm. It's literally a storm of brains, which is a storm of ideas. So we were saying ideas to in this case, to decide the episode. So we were brainstorming ideas for the new episode, this episode. And he's the one who suggested me the idea. He proposed this idea to me. In the beginning, I was not very keen of the idea. So keen, K-E-E-N, keen is when you are not, well, in this case, you are not convinced, you are not really into something. So in this case, I was not very keen of the idea. I didn't think it was like a good topic. But after a little discussion, I ended up loving it. And, well, here we are. So, before we begin, I will explain to you the meaning of the title of this episode, so you can decide if this is interesting to you. We named this episode The Longing for the Unwanted. The Longing for the Unwanted. On one of the episodes that I recorded before, an episode entitled Nostalgia, I talked a little about longing. I explained what longing was. And if you had not listened that episode, I recommend you to do it. It's a really nice episode. And well, we said that longing is the feeling of wanting something really bad. I mean, you wanted something really, really hard. And usually that something that people long is something that is lost or long gone. So it's not here anymore. It's gone. And usually for a long time. That is the meaning of long gone. And this word, longing, it's very used in poetry, poems in poetry, because it's a very romantic word. For instance, if you break up with your girlfriend or boyfriend, if you end a relationship with a person, after a short time, you start longing. And you can say, I long for her embrace, or I long for her kisses, or I long for her warmth, and things like that. So you miss those things and you long for those things. So that is longing. Now, in this case of this episode, what do we long for? What do we long for? The unwanted. 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 So in this case, we have this word, the word is wanted, and we have a prefix. So that is a little, in this case, two words that we put in the beginning of the word. That is why we call it prefix, because it comes before prefix. And in this case, the prefix is un, letters UN. And in this case, it indicates the opposite, so the contrary. So the unwanted is what we don't want, okay? But if we analyze this sentence, the longing for the unwanted, that is contradictory, right? So how can we want the unwanted? How can we long for the things that we don't want? Well, actually, this kind of sentence is known as an oxymoron. Oxymoron. That is OXYMORON. Oxymoron. And that is a sentence or an idea that is complemented by an opposite. It's like saying the loud silence. Silence is, of course, the absence of sound, and loud means with a very high volume in the sound. So when you say loud silence, that's an oxymoron. Or another example could be the cold fire. The fire is hot, but if you say cold fire, that is an oxymoron. So it's contradictory in itself, and this it's actually called a rhetorical figure, and is usually used in poetry. So I like poetry. So when I was thinking on this name, I immediately like this name. But anyway, let's move to the topic, the longing for the unwanted. So what the hell do I mean by that? Well, let me explain. A few weeks ago, I made a podcast about Star Wars Episode 7, the new movie of Star Wars. And we talked very generally about the expectation of the movie. As you probably know, it was announced in 2012 that Disney Corporation had bought, so Disney Corporation acquired the Star Wars franchise. And they announced a new trilogy of the saga. So in that moment, everybody went bananas. So they went crazy. This was a crazy thing to happen. And this was such big news because before this event happened, before Disney decided to buy Star Wars, nobody was expecting a new movie. For the hardcore fans, for the original fans and the most loyal fans, the story was finished. We had the original trilogy, and then we had the prequels, so episodes 1 to 6. So we were not expecting anything. But they say, we will make more movies, and in that exact moment, we start longing for the unwanted. 5 minutes before we knew this information, we did not want a new Star Wars movie. It was not even an idea in our mind. But now, all of a sudden, that means very suddenly, without any anticipation, we do. Now we want it. And that is exactly what I mean with this. Now, I used my Star Wars example because, to make reference to that episode of the podcast, but this happens all the time in a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different situations. Now, before I move to other kind of things, I want to use another example about movies. So, I grew up in the 90s. I'm right now, I'm 27 years old. What? I'm 27 years old. So, my childhood happened during the decade of the 1990s. And for me, personally, the 90s are represented by many things, but there is one in particular that represents to me the most, and that is Toy Story, the movie. I watched Toy Story 1 hundreds of times. I know every dialogue, every line of that movie. In fact, when I watch it again, when I happen to watch the movie again, I have to do it alone because I can't stop saying the lines and people get annoyed. People don't like when I am saying at the same time as the characters the lines. But I can't help it. I love Toy Story. Now, the end of Toy Story 1 kind of suggests the possibility of a second one. So when you finish watching Toy Story 1, for some reason you have the idea that a second movie might come. You know that Toy Story 2 is a real possibility. You can feel it. And it was, because 4 years later, so Toy Story 1 came out in 1995. And 4 years later, Toy Story 2 came out. And it was beautiful. It was another great movie. But after Toy Story 2, we were thinking, okay, that's it. That's the end of Toy Story. But then what happened? Well, then 8 years later, in 2007, Pixar announces that Toy Story 3 was in the making. So they were making a new movie about Toy Story, the continuation of the story, and Toy Story 3 was going to become a reality in 2009. And gosh, that was crazy. In that moment, again, the longing for the unwanted had begun. Because we didn't expect a new movie, but then they say it. And in that moment, we want that thing that just 2 seconds ago we didn't want. Now, in some cases, I think that it's a little different. Because, for example, sometimes we know that something is going to happen sooner or later. Something is bound to happen. So this word is B-O-U-N-D, bound. So when something is bound to, that means it's almost inevitable. So it's going to happen no matter what. For example, when a new band came out, a new music band came out, and they release their first album, their debut album, and if the album happens to be a good album, it's a great album, and they have commercial success and they receive good critics and all that, we know almost for a fact, so almost we are practically sure that a new album is coming, because musicians usually make a lot of albums on their careers, so we expect it. Like, I don't know, if I suppose that something like that happened with those big bands that exploded some years ago. Like, I don't know, I'm thinking on the Arctic Monkeys. The Arctic Monkeys were streaming their music online, and then they start getting attention, and then they released their first album, and people loved the Arctic Monkeys music, and then everybody knew that something was going to follow that a new album was bound to happen. So in that case, it was not so much a longing for the unwanted. But sometimes, and I will give you now a very fresh example, this phenomenon also occurs, also happens with music. For example, last week, Rihanna, the singer, released the first single of her new album. So this was her first album in 4 years. And people were expecting this new work because, again, as I told you, with the musicians, it's more like something that you know it's going to happen. But it was not clear when the new album was going to be ready. So people were expecting it, but they didn't. They were not longing for it because they didn't know the official date or any details about the album. But then she drops this single. She releases this single, and after the single was released, once again the longing for the unwanted started, because once again they have the single and they say, okay, now we want that album. Before the single, yeah, maybe we were expecting it, but we were not really longing it. But now that we have the first single, and now that we listened to it, now we want the complete album. Sometimes this can happen. Not only, of course, it doesn't happen only with movies or music. It can happen with anything that all of a sudden you want. For example, with books, I think that's another good example. With books, and specifically books that are made into films. So movies that are adaptations of books. So you read one book and you love it, and you are not expecting a movie, because not all books become movies, of course. So you just like the book. But then when they announce that a movie based on the book is being filmed, they are producing a movie based on the book that you read and that you liked, boom, the longing for the unwanted. So, what do you think about that? Well, finally, I will give you one more example. It's another personal example. And well, I don't think I have mentioned this before, but I love music. I love all kinds of music. I have a lot of different favorite bands, but one of my favorite bands of all time is a band called The Eels. It's E-E-L-S, Eels. And they are not very famous. Not a lot of people know their music, but I love their music. And for a long time, a really, really long time, I have been expecting that they come to Mexico so that I could go to one of their concerts. And I think that in the last 8 or maybe 10 years, the Eels have had tours around the world. They have gone out on tours, and sometimes they have come close here. They have visited South America, but they never came to Mexico. So right now, I am almost resigned. I had to put down my expectations, and I am resigned. Because now I know that they will not come to Mexico. Because maybe not many people know their music, and it's not a good commercial move for the band. But I know that if ever, anytime in the future, they announce that they are coming to Mexico, I will lose my mind. I will go crazy. And a long, long, and painful longing for the Unwanted will commence. From the moment they announce it to the moment of the concert, that is going to be my longing for the Unwanted. And well, how about you? Do you ever have this feeling, this sensation? I would really, really love to know what things awake on you this longing for the Unwanted. What are the things that happen, and then you know immediately that you will start longing for the before Unwanted? You can leave me your comments here in the iTunes Store review section. I would really, really appreciate it if you decided to leave me your comments here and at the same time give us a review. So you just have to choose how many stars you want to give us to rate this podcast, and that is going to help us a lot. So you can do it here on the iTunes Store review section, or you can do it on the post that I will make for this podcast. Every time we make a new episode of the podcast, we publish it in our website www.freetalkenglish.com/podcast. In that section you will find all the previous podcasts. Sometimes we have extra information, we have the show notes, and in this case, for example, I will leave in the post of this podcast a video with one of my favorite songs by the Eels, so you can know what I'm talking about. Maybe you know the Eels, maybe you like them, maybe you don't like them when you listen to the song, but anyways, I will leave it there so you can know what I am talking about. So I will see you next Wednesday for a new episode, and because you don't know what is the topic that I will discuss next episode, I hope you will long for the Unwanted. Keep it simple.